The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Ouagadougou, turning the red earth to dust that clung to everything. The corrugated roofs of the markets, the colorful fabrics hanging from street vendors' stalls, and the faces of children who ran barefoot between motorcycles and donkey carts. The air shimmered with heat and the cacophony of daily life. Merchants calling out prices in Moor and French, the rumble of overloaded trucks carrying goods from Ghana, and the distant sound of traditional drums echoing from the cultural center. In Etiabira, this symphony of organized chaos, life moved with its own rhythm. Women balanced impossible loads on their heads while navigating the crowded streets. Men gathered under the sparse shade of baobab trees, discussing politics in hushed tones that had grown more animated since the revolution. Children played with makeshift toys fashioned from bottle caps and wire, their laughter cutting through the tension that had settled over the capital since the French military withdrawal. But beneath the surface normalcy, something was stirring. In coffee shops and taxi stations, people whispered about change, real change. They spoke of Captain Ibrahim Traoré with a mixture of hope and cautious optimism that hadn't been felt in decades. For the first time in their collective memory, they had a leader who spoke their language, who understood their struggles, who had dared to tell the former colonial masters that their services were no longer required. It was into this atmosphere of tentative hope and simmering transformation that Dr. Amelia Laurent arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Stepping off an Air France flight with nothing but a medical bag, 2 suitcases, and a smile that would soon captivate an entire nation. The Centre Hospitalier Universitaire Pédiatrique Charles de Gaulle, known locally as Centre and Fond, was a sprawling complex of white buildings that gleamed like a beacon of hope against the red earth. It was here that the country's most vulnerable children received care, where mothers brought babies suffering from malnutrition, where pediatric surgeons performed miracles with limited resources, and where hope and heartbreak walked hand through sterile corridors. Dr. Laurent's arrival had been preceded by glowing recommendations from Médecins Sans Frontières and the French Medical Association. Her credentials were impeccable. Graduated summa cum laude from the Université Paris Descartes, specialized training in pediatric emergency medicine at Hôpital Necker Enfants Maladies, and 3 years of humanitarian work in Chad and Cameroon. More importantly, she came with her own funding, a private foundation from France that had donated 200,000 euros worth of medical supplies and equipment. Dr. Ousmane Kabore, the hospital's chief pediatrician, was initially skeptical. In his 30 years of practice, he had seen too many well-meaning European doctors arrive with grand plans only to leave when the reality of African medicine proved more challenging than their textbooks had prepared them for. But within her first week, Dr. Laurent had proven herself different. She arrived each morning at 6 a.m. before even the most dedicated local staff. She spoke French fluently and was making visible efforts to learn more, the local language. When faced with the hospital's chronic shortages, no electricity for 6 hours a day, insufficient sterilization equipment, expired medications, she didn't complain or demand immediate solutions. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and worked within the system, finding creative ways to provide quality care despite the limitations. More remarkably, she seemed to genuinely care about her patients. Dr. Kabore watched her spend an hour comforting a mother whose child was dying from complications of measles, a disease that should have been easily preventable. He saw her use her own money to buy food for families who had traveled from rural villages and had no resources to sustain themselves during their children's treatment. He witnessed her stay up all night manually ventilating a premature baby, when the hospital's only ventilator failed. "She has the hands of a healer and the heart of a mother," Dr. Kabore told his wife one evening. Perhaps I was wrong about European doctors. By her second week, word of the white doctor had spread throughout Ouagadougou. Radio stations began reporting on her work. The national television station sent a crew to film her treating children with severe acute malnutrition carefully, hand-feeding therapeutic milk to babies who weighed less than their age in months. The images were powerful. A blonde woman in a white coat, her gentle hands cradling African children, her blue eyes filled with compassion as she whispered words of comfort in broken Moor. The media narrative wrote itself, "Angel from Paris brings hope to Burkina Faso's children. European doctor dedicates life to African healing. Mama Amelia, the white mother of Ouagadougou." Social media amplified the story exponentially. Photos of Dr. Laurent went viral, feeding malnourished children, teaching young mothers about nutrition, distributing free vitamins and supplements. International news outlets picked up the story. CNN featured her in a segment about humanitarian heroes. The BBC interviewed her via satellite, and her soft-spoken dedication to helping Africa's most vulnerable children moved viewers across the globe. What the cameras and journalists didn't capture were the moments after the interviews, when Dr. Laurent would retreat to her modest apartment in the Ouaga 2000 district and place encrypted phone calls to a number in Abidjan, Ivory Coast. "The cover is holding perfectly," she would report in rapid French. "Media penetration is beyond expectations. Local trust is building rapidly." On the other end of the line, Colonel Thierry Morel would listen with the practiced patience of a man who had orchestrated dozens of such operations across Francophone Africa. Tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic appearance, Morel was the DGSE's top operative in West Africa. He had been running intelligence operations in the region for 15 years, watching French influence slowly erode as new leaders emerged with ideas about sovereignty and independence that threatened decades of carefully maintained neo-colonial relationships. "Remember," he would remind her, "you are building a foundation of trust that must support the weight of your ultimate mission. Take your time. Be patient. The target is cautious, but he is also human. Even the most suspicious man will lower his guard for someone who saves children." Dr. Laurent, whose real name was Clémence Fournier, had been recruited by the DGSE 3 years earlier. Born in Lyon to a military family, she had genuinely pursued medical training before being approached during her residency by a recruiter who recognized her unique combination of medical expertise, language skills, and psychological profile that made her ideal for deep cover operations. Her training had been extensive and sophisticated. 6 months at the DGSE facility in Serkot, learning the fundamentals of intelligence gathering, surveillance, and counter-surveillance. Another 4 months specializing in chemical and biological weapons, including exotic toxins that could mimic natural illnesses. Psychological conditioning to maintain her cover identity even under extreme stress. Language immersion not just in French colonial dialects, but in several West African languages, and perhaps most importantly, training in what the agency called humanitarian manipulation, using genuine aid and medical care as a vehicle for intelligence operations. The choice of Burkina Faso as her assignment was strategic. Captain Ibrahim Traore had emerged as the most problematic leader in France's former empire. His decision to expel French troops had created a domino effect, inspiring similar actions in Mali and Niger. His rhetoric about African dignity and economic independence was gaining traction across the continent. Intelligence reports suggested he was building relationships with Russia and China, seeking alternatives to France's traditional role as the region's primary political and economic partner. From Paris's perspective, Traoré represented an existential threat to French interests in West Africa. The region's uranium, gold, and other strategic resources were vital to France's economy. The CFA franc system that tied the economies of 14 African nations to French monetary policy was worth billions in economic advantages. Military bases that provided strategic depth and power projection capabilities were crucial to France's global influence. The decision to eliminate Traoré had been made at the highest levels of the French government, though it would never be documented or acknowledged. The operation was designated Operation Hypocrite, a name that captured the dark irony of using the medical profession's sacred oath of "do no harm" as cover for assassination. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was a man shaped by contradiction and complexity. At 34, he was one of Africa's youngest heads of state, yet his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much too early. Born in the rural village of Bondokwi, he had grown up in the poverty that characterized rural Burkina Faso. No electricity, no running water, schooling that ended abruptly when his family could no longer afford the fees. But Traoré possessed two qualities that would define his trajectory: and fierce intelligence that allowed him to excel academically despite limited resources, and an unwavering sense of justice that made him physically unable to accept unfairness without fighting back. These traits led him first to military school, then to rapid advancement through the ranks of Burkina Faso's armed forces, and finally to the revolutionary movement that brought him to power. The revolution had not been planned as much as it had been inevitable. Years of watching French companies extract billions in resources while ordinary Burkinabés struggled to afford basic necessities had created a powder keg of resentment. The spark came when the previous government signed a new mining agreement that gave French corporations even more favorable terms while providing virtually no benefits to local communities. Traoré's military training had taught him strategy and tactics, but it was his natural political instincts that made him a true leader. He understood that sustainable revolution required more than military force. It required the genuine support of the people and a vision for the future that offered real hope for improvement. His first acts as president had been carefully calculated. To demonstrate both his commitment to change and his competence as a leader, he eliminated the ceremonial trappings of the presidency, the luxury cars, the excessive security details, the ornate offices, and moved into a modest residence where citizens could request meetings. He mandated that all government contracts above $10,000 be published online for public review. Most significantly, he announced a comprehensive audit of all foreign economic agreements, with the stated goal of renegotiating terms that better served Burkinabé interests. But Traoré was also a realist who understood the dangers he faced. African leaders who challenged the established order had a tendency to meet unfortunate ends. Assassinations disguised as coups, plane crashes blamed on mechanical failure, sudden illnesses that proved mysteriously untreatable. He had studied these patterns carefully and taken extensive precautions. His security detail was personally selected and included individuals who had proven their loyalty through years of shared struggle. His food was prepared by a trusted staff and tested by experts. His movements were kept secret and changed at the last minute. Most importantly, he had cultivated a network of intelligence contacts, some from allies like Algeria and Ghana, others from unexpected sources, that kept him informed about potential threats. It was this network that first alerted him to unusual French intelligence activity in the region. A source in Abidjan reported increased encrypted communications between French diplomatic facilities and Paris. Another contact noted the arrival of several French nationals with suspicious travel patterns and documentation. A third observed training activities at a facility in Ivory Coast that seemed inconsistent with diplomatic functions. None of this intelligence was specific enough to identify particular threats, but it created a general state of heightened awareness. Traoré increased his security protocols and instructed his intelligence chief, Colonel Moussa Diallo, to monitor all French activities in Burkina Faso more closely. It was in this context that reports of the remarkable French doctor began reaching the president's attention. Dr. Traoré mentioned her during a routine briefing about healthcare improvements. The Minister of Health praised her contributions during a cabinet meeting. Even Traoré's own physician, Dr. Mamadou Sori, spoke admiringly of her technical skills and humanitarian dedication. Under normal circumstances, Traoré would have been pleased by such reports. Foreign expertise and assistance, when genuinely offered, could contribute significantly to Burkina Faso's development goals. But these were not normal circumstances, and Traoré had not survived this long by ignoring his instincts. He instructed Colonel Diallo to conduct a discreet background investigation of Dr. Laurent. The initial results seemed to confirm her humanitarian credentials: medical school records from Paris, previous work with MSF, testimonials from colleagues. But Diallo had been trained by East German Stasi officers during the Cold War, and he knew how to look beneath surface appearances. He noticed small inconsistencies, gaps in her employment history that were explained as private practice, but couldn't be verified. Recommendation letters that were genuine but came from doctors who had unusually limited knowledge of her actual work. Financial records that showed resources beyond what would be expected from her stated employment history. Most concerning were her behavioral patterns. Diallo had arranged for discreet surveillance, and his observers noted that Dr. Laurent's movements included activities that seemed inconsistent with purely medical work. She made regular trips to internet cafes, despite having connectivity at her apartment. She had been observed meeting with individuals who had no apparent connection to healthcare or humanitarian work. Her apartment received deliveries from companies that had no clear medical purpose. None of this constituted proof of malicious intent, but it established a pattern that warranted increased attention. Diallo shared his findings with Traoré, who made a decision that would prove fateful. He would meet this doctor personally and form his own assessment. The hospital visit was announced publicly as part of Traoré's regular outreach to key institutions, but the timing and specific itinerary were kept secret until the morning of the visit. This was standard security protocol, designed to prevent advance planning by potential threats while still allowing the hospital staff time to prepare. Dr. Laurent learned of the visit when Dr. Caboret called her at 7 a.m., his voice betraying both excitement and nervousness. "The president is coming today," he announced. "He wants to see the children's ward and meet with key staff. Please make yourself available." For a trained operative, unexpected events are both opportunities and dangers. Dr. Laurent's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. "Of course," she replied. "I'm honored to meet him. Should I prepare anything special?" "Just be yourself," Dr. Caboret advised. He values authenticity above protocol. Dr. Laurent spent the morning in careful preparation. She selected her outfit: clean white coat, modest blue dress underneath, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back professionally. She reviewed her cover story, ensuring she could answer any questions about her background, training, or motivations. Most importantly, she practiced the demeanor that had served her so well: warm but professional, confident but humble, foreign but respectful of local customs. The president's arrival at 2 p.m. was preceded by a small advance team that checked the building and established security protocols. Unlike many African leaders, Traoré traveled with a relatively modest entourage: 2 armored vehicles, 6 security personnel, and a small support staff. He eschewed the dramatic motorcades and excessive security displays that many of his predecessors had favored. Traoré moved through the hospital with purpose, stopping to speak with patients and families, observing the facilities, asking practical questions about resources and needs. Dr. Laurent watched from a distance, studying his mannerisms and interactions. He was shorter than she had expected, perhaps 5'8", but he carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. His uniform was simple and well-maintained rather than ornate. Most notably, his engagement with patients, and staff seemed genuine rather than performative. When he reached the pediatric intensive care unit, Dr. Caboret made the introductions. "Mr. President, this is Dr. Amelia Laurent, the French physician I mentioned who has been doing such remarkable work with our children." Traoré turned to face her, and Dr. Laurent found herself looking into eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. His handshake was firm but brief, his expression polite but measuring. "Doctor," he said in French, "I've heard excellent reports about your work. How are you finding Burkina Faso?" "It's been an incredible experience, Mr. President," she replied. "The staff here is so dedicated and the children are remarkably resilient. I feel privileged to contribute in whatever small way I can." "What brought you here specifically?" he asked. "There are humanitarian needs throughout Africa. Why Burkina Faso?" It was a more probing question than she had expected, but she had anticipated it. "I wanted to work somewhere I could make a real difference," she replied. "Your country is undergoing such positive changes, and I wanted to be part of that transformation, especially for the children who represent the future." Traoré nodded thoughtfully, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked Dr. Cabaret to show him the equipment Dr. Laurent had provided. As they examined the new cardiac monitors and ultrasound machines, a small drama unfolded that neither had scripted. A 7-year-old boy named Abdoulaye, who was being treated for severe pneumonia, had recognized the president despite being weak and barely conscious. With tremendous effort, the child managed to raise his hand and whisper, "Capitaine, merci." The scene was spontaneous and powerful. Traoré knelt beside the bed, took the child's hand, and spoke to him in more words of encouragement and hope that the boy might not have fully understood, but whose meaning was unmistakable. When the child managed a weak smile, there wasn't a dry eye among the staff members present. Dr. Laurent watched this interaction with professional interest, but something unexpected happened. Despite her training and psychological preparation, she found herself genuinely moved by the president's obvious care for the child and the child's faith in his leader. For a brief moment, her emotional response was authentic, rather than calculated. It was at that moment that Traoré stood and turned back to her. Perhaps he sensed her momentary lapse in professional composure, or perhaps it was coincidence, but he asked another question that caught her off guard. "Do you have children, Dr. Laurent?" The question was simple, but it hit her in an unexpected place. Her cover story included details about a fictional fiancé in France, but had deliberately omitted children to avoid complications. However, the authentic emotion she had just experienced made her hesitate fractionally before answering. "No," she replied, "not yet. But working with children like Abdoulaye makes me hope that someday—" She let the sentence trail off, allowing him to draw his own conclusions. Traoré studied her face for a long moment before nodding. "Children change everything," he said quietly. "They make you think about the future in ways you never expected." The moment passed, and the visit continued. Traoré spent another hour at the hospital before departing, but Dr. Laurent noticed that he seemed more reserved with her during his remaining interactions. Nothing overt, but a subtle change in tone that suggested increased wariness. That evening, she filed her report to Colonel Morel. Initial contact established successfully. Target appears suspicious by nature, but not specifically of me. Recommend proceeding with trust-building phase. What she didn't report was the strange feeling she had experienced during the child's interaction with Traoré, a moment when her professional detachment had wavered, and she had seen him not as a target, but as a human being who genuinely cared about his people's welfare. What she also didn't know was that Traoré had been equally affected by their encounter, though in a different way. As his motorcade left the hospital, he turned to Colonel Diallo and said, "There's something about that doctor. I can't identify it precisely, but my instincts are telling me to be careful." The weeks following the hospital visit marked a crucial phase in Dr. Laurent's mission. Her brief encounter with Traoré had given her valuable insights into his personality and demeanor, but it had also confirmed that he was naturally suspicious and would not be easily deceived. She would need to build trust gradually and carefully. Her strategy was elegant in its simplicity: become indispensable to people close to the president. Rather than seeking direct access, which might raise suspicions, she would create a network of relationships that would naturally draw her into his orbit. She began with Dr. Mamadou Sori, the president's personal physician. At 63, Dr. Sori was a respected figure in Burkina Faso's medical community. He had trained in France in the 1980s and maintained connections with French medical institutions, making him a natural ally for a visiting European colleague. Dr. Laurent approached Dr. Sori with a carefully crafted proposal. She had noticed, she said, that many of the country's senior officials appeared to be suffering from stress-related health issues. The pressures of governing during a time of transition, combined with the climate and dietary changes that came with high office, were taking a visible toll. Would Dr. Sori be interested in collaborating on a preventive health program for government officials? The proposal was brilliant because it addressed a genuine need while positioning Dr. Laurent as a valuable resource. Dr. Sori had indeed been concerned about the health impacts of political stress on his high-profile patients. He readily agreed to the collaboration. Within 2 weeks, Dr. Laurent was conducting health screenings for ministers, military officers, and senior civil servants. She approached each consultation with meticulous professionalism, providing genuine medical value while carefully gathering intelligence about their routines, relationships, and access to the president. Defense Minister Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba was particularly valuable. A career military officer who had served with Traoré during their rise through the ranks, Damiba had direct access to the president and frequently attended security briefings. During his health consultation, Dr. Laurent learned that he suffered from chronic back pain that affected his sleep and concentration. She prescribed a combination of physical therapy, dietary supplements, and stress management techniques that provided genuine relief. Within a week, Damiba's pain had decreased significantly, and his energy levels had improved markedly. When Dr. Sori inquired about his improved condition, Damiba praised Dr. Laurent enthusiastically. "That French doctor is remarkable," he told Dr. Sori. She identified problems that our local physicians had missed and provided solutions that actually work. The president should meet her properly. She could help with some of his own health concerns. Dr. Sori had indeed noticed that Traoré was showing signs of the stress that came with his position. The president's sleep patterns were irregular. His appetite had decreased, and he occasionally experienced headaches that seemed related to tension rather than any underlying medical condition. When Damiba suggested involving Dr. Laurent, Dr. Sori found the idea appealing. The conversation that would change everything took place on a Thursday evening in Dr. Sori's office. Traoré had come for a routine checkup, and Dr. Sori broached the subject carefully. "Captain," he began, "I've been observing some signs that concern me. Your stress levels are higher than I would like, and I think it would be beneficial to consult with a specialist." Traoré raised an eyebrow. "What kind of specialist?" "There's a French physician working at the hospital who has extensive experience with executive health issues. She's been helping several of your ministers with stress-related problems, and the results have been remarkable." "The same doctor from the hospital visit?" Traoré asked. "Yes, Dr. Laurent. She's developed some innovative approaches that might be helpful." Traoré was quiet for a long moment. His natural suspicion was engaged, but he also trusted Dr. Sori's medical judgment. Moreover, he was aware that the stress of leadership was taking a physical toll that could affect his ability to serve his people effectively. "I'll consider it," he said finally. That consideration lasted 3 days. During that time, Traoré consulted with Colonel Diallo about the ongoing surveillance of Dr. Laurent. The intelligence chief reported that her activities continued to include some anomalous behaviors, but nothing that constituted clear evidence of hostile intent. More significantly, Traoré spoke with several of the officials who had consulted with Dr. Laurent. Their testimonials were uniformly positive. Defense Minister Damiba's improvement was particularly notable. He seemed more energetic and focused than he had in months. The decision to meet with Dr. Laurent was made on a Sunday evening, but with careful security protocols. Rather than a formal appointment, Traoré would invite her to the presidential residence for what would appear to be a social dinner, but would actually be a careful assessment of her character and motivations. The invitation was delivered through Dr. Traoré on Monday morning. "The president would like to invite you to dinner at the residence on Wednesday evening," he told Dr. Laurent. "Nothing formal, just an opportunity for him to thank you personally for your contributions to our country's healthcare." Dr. Laurent's training had prepared her for this moment, but she still felt a surge of adrenaline. "I would be honored," she replied. "Should I bring anything special?" "Just yourself," Dr. Traoré smiled. The president values genuine conversation above protocol. That evening, Dr. Laurent placed an encrypted call to Colonel Morel. "Phase 2 has begun," she reported. "I have access to the target's private residence. The trust-building strategy has succeeded." Morel's response was cautious. "Remember that this is likely a test as much as an opportunity. He will be evaluating you carefully. Maintain your cover completely, but begin the subtle intelligence gathering that will inform the final phase." Dr. Laurent spent Tuesday in meticulous preparation. She researched Burkina Faso customs around dinner invitations, selected an outfit that would be appropriate for the occasion, and reviewed every aspect of her cover story. Most importantly, she mentally prepared herself for the psychological challenge of maintaining her false identity while sitting across from a man she was planning to kill. The presidential residence was notably modest for a head of state's home. Located in the Ouaga 2000 district, it was a two-story building that had previously served as housing for foreign diplomats. Traoré had chosen it specifically because it was comfortable, but not ostentatious, sending a message that he served the people rather than living above them. Dr. Laurent arrived at 7 p.m., driven by a government car that Dr. Traoré had arranged. The security screening was thorough but professional. Her purse was searched, she passed through a metal detector, and her identification was carefully checked. However, she noticed that the guards seemed relaxed rather than tense, suggesting this was routine security rather than high-alert protocols. She was escorted into a sitting room decorated with traditional Burkina Faso artwork and comfortable but simple furniture. Through the windows, she could see a small garden where children's toys suggested that the president's family lived a relatively normal domestic life. Traoré entered the room 10 minutes later, dressed in civilian clothes rather than his military uniform. He greeted her warmly but formally, and she noticed that his demeanor seemed more relaxed than during their hospital encounter. "Dr. Laurent, thank you for accepting my invitation. I hope you don't mind the informal setting. I find that real conversations happen better over dinner than in offices." "Not at all, Mr. President. I'm honored to be here." The dinner was served in a small dining room adjacent to the sitting area. The meal was traditional Burkina Faso cuisine prepared with obvious care. Riz gras with tender meat, atieke with grilled fish, and fresh vegetables from the residence garden. Dr. Laurent complimented the food genuinely, having developed an appreciation for West African cooking during her months in the region. The conversation began with safe topics: her impressions of Burkina Faso, the challenges of practicing medicine in resource-limited settings, cultural differences between France and West Africa. Traoré was an engaging conversationalist, asking thoughtful questions and sharing insights about his country's history and aspirations. But as the evening progressed, his questions became more probing. He asked about her decision to leave a comfortable life in France for humanitarian work in Africa. He inquired about her long-term plans and whether she intended to make a permanent commitment to the continent. Most challenging, he asked about her perspective on France's relationship with its former African colonies. "It's a complicated history," she replied carefully. "I think many French people of my generation recognize that past relationships were problematic, and we want to contribute to building something more equitable and respectful." "That's a diplomatic answer," Traoré observed with a slight smile. But what do you personally think about France's current role in Africa? It was a test, and Dr. Laurent knew it. Her response would reveal whether she was merely polite or genuinely thoughtful about the political realities of the region. I think, she said slowly, that Africa needs to define its own path forward. External assistance should support African goals and priorities, not substitute for them. Too often in the past, help came with conditions that served the interests of the helpers more than the helped. Traoré nodded approvingly. That's a perspective I wish more Europeans shared. Unfortunately, not everyone has moved beyond the old patterns of thinking. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, ranging across topics from healthcare policy to economic development to the challenges of governance in a rapidly changing world. Dr. Laurent found herself genuinely impressed by Traoré's intelligence and thoughtfulness. He was clearly well-read, had a sophisticated understanding of international affairs, and demonstrated genuine concern for his people's welfare. More troubling from her professional perspective, she found herself liking him. This was not supposed to happen. Her training had emphasized the importance of maintaining emotional distance from targets, but Traoré's obvious sincerity and dedication were breaking down her psychological barriers. As the evening wound down, Traoré made a request that caught her off guard. Dr. Sori tells me that you've been helpful with stress-related health issues among my staff. I have to admit that this job comes with pressures I hadn't fully anticipated. Would you be willing to provide me with a health consultation? Nothing. Urgent, but I'd appreciate your professional assessment. This was exactly what she had been working toward. But now that the opportunity had arrived, she felt a moment of hesitation. Looking at this man who had treated her as an honored guest, who had shared his thoughts and concerns with openness and trust, she experienced something she hadn't expected. Guilt. Of course, Mr. President. I would be happy to help. They arranged for a consultation the following evening. As Dr. Laurent was preparing to leave, Traoré made one final comment that would haunt her. Thank you for this evening, Doctor. It's rare to meet someone whose actions seem so clearly motivated by genuine compassion. I hope we can work together to improve the health of our people. The drive back to her apartment was silent, but Dr. Laurent's mind was racing. She had succeeded in gaining access to her target, but the emotional cost was higher than she had anticipated. For the first time since accepting the mission, she questioned whether she could complete it. That night, she placed her report to Colonel Morel. Trust established. Access granted. Final phase can proceed as planned. But she didn't mention the doubt that was growing in her mind, or the fact that she was beginning to see Ibrahim Traoré not as a target, but as a human being whose death would be a genuine loss to his people and his continent. The medical consultation was scheduled for 7 p.m. the following evening, in a private office within the presidential residence. Dr. Laurent spent the day in careful preparation, but her focus was divided between professional requirements and personal turmoil. Physically, she prepared the tools of assassination. The cyano poison, a sophisticated compound derived from tetrodotoxin, had been provided by DGSE specialists. It was odorless, tasteless, and would cause symptoms that closely resembled a heart attack. Most importantly, it was undetectable by standard toxicology screens available in Burkina Faso. The delivery system was elegant, a vitamin supplement that appeared identical to standard commercial products, but contained a lethal dose. Psychologically, she struggled with unprecedented doubts. Her dinner with Traoré had revealed him to be intelligent, compassionate, and genuinely committed to his people's welfare. The realization that she was planning to kill someone she actually respected was creating emotional conflicts that her training had not prepared her to handle. She attempted to rationalize her mission by focusing on its strategic importance. Traoré's policies were disrupting established relationships that had provided stability in the region. His anti-French rhetoric was encouraging similar movements in other countries. His economic reforms threatened important French interests. From this perspective, his elimination would serve broader stability and French national interests. But these rational arguments felt hollow when measured against her direct experience of his character and motivations. She had seen the way children's faces lit up when he visited the hospital. She had witnessed his genuine concern for his people's health and welfare. She had experienced firsthand his thoughtful approach to governance and his sophisticated understanding of complex issues. As the appointed time approached, Dr. Laurent made a decision that surprised even her. She would go through with the consultation, but make a final assessment before administering the poison. If her closer examination confirmed her positive impression, she would abort the mission and face the consequences. She arrived at the presidential residence at exactly 7 p.m., carrying her medical bag with its deadly cargo. The security screening was routine, and she was escorted to a small office that had been prepared for the consultation. The room contained a comfortable chair, a simple desk, and adequate lighting for a medical examination. Traoré arrived a few minutes later, apologizing for the delay. He had been in a phone conference with other West African leaders about regional economic cooperation, a conversation that had run longer than expected but had produced promising developments. The consultation can proceed exactly as it would in any medical setting, he told her. Please treat me as you would any other patient. Dr. Laurent began with standard protocols, checking blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory function. All of Traoré's vital signs were within normal ranges, though his blood pressure was slightly elevated in a way consistent with job-related stress. As she conducted the examination, they talked about his sleep patterns, dietary habits, and exercise routine. Traoré was candid about the challenges of maintaining healthy habits while managing the demands of the presidency. He admitted that he often worked late into the night, sometimes forgot to eat regular meals, and had little time for the physical exercise that had been part of his military routine. It sounds like classic executive stress syndrome, Dr. Laurent observed. The good news is that the problems are manageable with some lifestyle adjustments and appropriate supplements. She reached into her medical bag and extracted several bottles of vitamins and supplements, including the one containing the poison. Her heart was beating rapidly, but her hands remained steady. These will help with energy levels and stress management, she explained, opening each bottle and describing its contents and benefits. The most important is this multivitamin complex. It contains nutrients that are often depleted by stress and irregular eating patterns. She opened the bottle containing the poisoned supplement and extracted a single capsule, placing it in a small dish on the desk. This was the moment of no return. Once Traoré swallowed the capsule, he would be dead within 12 hours, and her mission would be complete. "Take this one in the evening," she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "It will help. You sleep better and manage stress more effectively." Traoré picked up the capsule and examined it briefly. "You've been very thorough, doctor. I appreciate your professionalism." As he lifted the capsule toward his mouth, Dr. Laurent experienced a moment of absolute clarity. She saw not a political target, but a father, a leader who genuinely cared about his people, a man whose death would leave his country vulnerable and his children orphaned. In that instant, her carefully constructed rationalization collapsed completely. "Wait," she said suddenly. Traoré paused, the capsule still in his hand, and looked at her with mild curiosity. "Is something wrong?" Dr. Laurent's training screamed at her to remain silent, to let the mission proceed, but her conscience had finally overpowered her conditioning. I need to check something first," she stammered. "There may be an interaction with other medications. May I see that for a moment?" Traoré handed her the capsule without suspicion. Dr. Laurent took it with trembling fingers and pretended to examine it closely while her mind raced through the implications of what she was about to do. "Actually," she said, placing the capsule back in the bottle, "I think we should wait on this particular supplement. Let me consult with Dr. Sori first, to make sure it's appropriate given your current health status. Traoré nodded agreeably. Of course. Safety first. He paused, studying her face with the perceptiveness that had helped him survive in a dangerous political environment. Are you feeling all right, doctor? You seem a bit pale. I'm fine, she replied, forcing a smile. Just being cautious. The other supplements are perfectly safe to begin immediately. The consultation concluded with Dr. Laurent providing genuine medical advice about stress management, dietary improvements, and exercise routines. As she packed her medical bag, her hands shook slightly as she secured the bottle containing the unused poison. Traoré walked her to the door personally, thanking her for her time and expertise. I look forward to working with you further, he said warmly. It's reassuring to know that we have such dedicated healthcare professionals available. As Dr. Laurent left the presidential residence, she knew that her life had fundamentally changed. She had committed an act of betrayal against her own country and intelligence service, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could live with herself. Dr. Laurent's apartment felt different when she returned that evening. The familiar space now seemed like a stage set for a performance she was no longer willing to continue. She sat in her small kitchen, staring at the encrypted phone she used to communicate with Colonel Morel, knowing that she would have to make a choice that would determine the rest of her life. Her training had covered scenarios where missions needed to be aborted due to changing circumstances or security compromises. But it had never addressed situations where an operative's moral convictions conflicted with mission requirements. She was in uncharted territory, both professionally and personally. After 2 hours of internal debate, she made her decision. She would not complete the assassination, but neither would she immediately confess to Colonel Morel. Instead, she would attempt to extract herself from the situation gradually, citing security concerns or operational difficulties that made the mission infeasible. She composed a carefully worded message. Consultation completed successfully. Trust. Relationship established. However, target security protocols more sophisticated than anticipated. Request time to assess optimal timing for final phase. Morel's response came within an hour. Understood. Take necessary precautions, but do not delay unnecessarily. Window of opportunity may close if regional political situation continues to evolve. The message contained an implicit threat that Dr. Laurent understood perfectly. The DGSE did not tolerate failed missions, particularly those involving high-value targets. If she could not complete her assignment successfully, she would likely be eliminated as a security liability. Over the next 3 days, Dr. Laurent maintained her cover. While desperately searching for a way out of her predicament, she continued her work at the hospital, attended social functions with the medical community, and even had 2 more consultations with government officials. To external observers, she appeared to be functioning normally, but internally, she was planning her escape. She began quietly liquidating her financial resources, converting her euros to cash that could be easily transported. She researched travel routes that might allow her to leave West Africa without using official channels that the DGSE could monitor. Most importantly, she started documenting evidence of her mission that she could use as leverage if necessary. Her plan was interrupted on Thursday morning by an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sori arrived at the hospital earlier than usual and asked to speak with her privately. Amelia, he said, using the familiar name that her colleagues had adopted. I need to discuss something sensitive with you. They moved to his office, and Dr. Sori closed the door before continuing. I've received some concerning information, he said carefully. There are questions being raised about your background and activities here in Burkina Faso. Dr. Laurent's training kicked in automatically. What kind of questions? Intelligence services have been making inquiries. Nothing official, you understand. But discreet investigations into your history, your contacts, your movements since arriving here. Dr. Laurent felt her pulse accelerate, but she maintained her composure. "That seems routine for any foreign national working in sensitive areas. I have nothing to hide." Dr. Sori studied her face carefully. "I hope that's true, Amelia. Because if there's anything you need to tell me, now would be the time. The President has specifically asked me to convey that he values honesty above all other qualities." The message was clear. They suspected her, but they were giving her an opportunity to confess voluntarily. Dr. Laurent realized that her window for escape was rapidly closing. "I appreciate the President's confidence," she replied. "If there are specific concerns, I'm happy to address them directly." That evening, Dr. Laurent made a decision that would seal her fate. Instead of attempting to flee immediately, she would try one last gambit. She would request another meeting with President Traoré, ostensibly to provide him with the additional health consultation she had promised, but actually to assess whether he had definitive evidence of her true identity and mission. The request was granted for the following evening, but with a change in protocol that should have warned her. Instead of meeting at the presidential residence, she was asked to come to an office within the presidential complex, a more formal, secure environment. The presidential complex in Ouagadougou was a cluster of government buildings surrounded by high walls and sophisticated security systems. Dr. Laurent had never been inside the complex before, and she immediately noticed the difference in atmosphere. This was not the relaxed, informal setting of their previous meetings, but a place where serious business was conducted under careful observation. She was escorted through multiple security checkpoints, each more thorough than the last. Her medical bag was examined in detail, and she was required to pass through advanced scanning equipment. The guards were professional but alert, and she noticed additional personnel positioned at strategic locations throughout the complex. The office where she was taken was spartanly furnished with a large wooden table, several chairs, and walls, lined with maps and photographs. Unlike the warm, personal environment of the presidential residence, this space conveyed authority and power. President Traoré entered the room accompanied by two other individuals. Dr. Laurent had not previously met. One was a tall, lean man in civilian clothes whom Traoré introduced as Colonel Diallo. The other was a woman in military uniform identified as Captain Awa Diabe. "Dr. Laurent," Traoré said formally, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." As she sat down, Dr. Laurent noticed that Traoré's demeanor had changed completely from their previous encounters. Gone was the warmth and openness she had experienced. In its place was the controlled intensity of a military officer conducting a serious interrogation. "We have some questions we'd like to ask you," he continued, "about your background and your activities since arriving in Burkina Faso." Colonel Diallo opened a thick folder and began placing photographs on the table. Dr. Laurent's heart sank as she recognized images of herself in Abidjan, meeting with Colonel Morel at various locations. Over the past several months, the surveillance had been so discreet that she had never detected it, but it had been comprehensive enough to document her intelligence activities in detail. "Can you explain these meetings?" Traoré asked quietly. Dr. Laurent's training had prepared her for interrogation, but she realized immediately that denying the obvious would be futile. The evidence was too clear and comprehensive. "I can explain," she said slowly, "but I think you already know most of what I would tell you." Captain Diabe leaned forward. "We know that you are not really Dr. Amelia Laurent. We know that you are an agent of the French External Intelligence Service. What we want to understand is the specific nature of your mission here." The game was over, and Dr. Laurent knew it. Her only remaining option was to cooperate fully and hope that her decision not to complete the assassination would be viewed as a mitigating factor. "My real name is Clémence Fournier," she began. I was an operative for the DGSE. I was sent here to," she paused, struggling with the words, "to eliminate President Traoré." The room was silent for a long moment. Captain Diabe took notes, while Colonel Diallo continued to study the photographs. President Traoré's expression remained impassive, but Dr. Laurent could see the impact of her confession in his eyes. "How?" he asked simply. Dr. Laurent reached into her medical bag and withdrew the bottle containing the poisoned supplements. "With this. During a medical consultation. It was designed to appear like a heart attack." She placed the bottle on the table between them. "But I couldn't do it," she added quickly. "When I had the opportunity, I couldn't go through with it." "Why not?" Traoré asked. "Because—" She struggled to find the words. "Because you're not what they told me you were. You're not a threat to stability or a dangerous radical. You're someone who genuinely cares about his people and his country. You're trying to build something better, not destroy something good." Colonel Diallo examined the bottle carefully. "We'll need to have this analyzed to confirm its contents." "You'll find tetrodotoxin," Dr. Laurent said. "A sophisticated poison that's virtually undetectable with standard equipment." The interrogation continued for 2 more hours. Dr. Laurent provided complete details about her training, her mission briefing, her intelligence contacts, and the broader DGSE operations in West Africa. She held nothing back, partly because resistance was futile, but primarily because she had genuinely switched sides in her own mind. By the end of the session, they had a comprehensive understanding of French intelligence activities in the region, including the identities of other operatives and the locations of safe houses and communication facilities. As the interrogation concluded, President Traoré asked one final question. "What did you think would happen to you once you had completed your mission?" "I would have been extracted to France and reassigned," Dr. Laurent replied. "The official story would have been that I was recalled due to security concerns." "And what do you think will happen to you now that you've confessed?" Dr. Laurent considered the question carefully. "I assume I'll be imprisoned or executed, but I want you to know that I don't regret my decision. You deserve to live, and your people deserve the leadership you're providing." Traoré nodded slowly. "Take her to the detention facility," he told the guards. "Treat her well, but keep her secure. We have more questions, and we'll need her testimony for what comes next." The detention facility beneath the presidential complex was not the harsh prison cell Dr. Laurent had expected. Instead, it was a simple but adequate room with a bed, desk, and private bathroom. While clearly secure, it was designed for important detainees who needed to be kept comfortable for extended periods. Dr. Laurent spent her first night in custody reflecting on the choices that had brought her to this point. Despite her uncertain future, she felt a sense of relief that she had never experienced during her months of living a double life. The psychological burden of deception had been heavier than she had realized. The next morning, Captain Diabe arrived with breakfast and a set of questions that would form the basis for Dr. Laurent's formal testimony. The interrogation was professional and thorough, but not hostile. Captain Diabe seemed more interested in understanding the full scope of French intelligence operations than in punishing Dr. Laurent personally. "We need to know everything," Captain Diabe explained. "Names, locations, methods, future plans. This information will be used to protect not just Burkina Faso, but other African countries that may be targeted." Dr. Laurent provided comprehensive details about DGSE structure and operations in West Africa. She identified Colonel Morel and his network of operatives, described training facilities and safe houses, and explained the communication systems used to coordinate intelligence activities. Most importantly, she revealed that she was not the only assassination operative in the region. Similar missions were planned or already underway in Mali, Niger, and Senegal, targeting leaders who had challenged French interests. The scope of the operation was far broader than anyone had imagined. "They call it Operation Hippocrates," she explained. The irony of using the medical oath to cover assassination missions was considered appropriate by the planners. As her debriefing continued over several days, Dr. Laurent began to understand how thoroughly she had been monitored since her arrival in Burkina Faso. President Traoré's intelligence services, while modest by international standards, had been remarkably effective at identifying and tracking threats. Colonel Diallo visited her personally to explain how they had detected her true identity. "We have sources throughout West Africa," he told her. "Your activities in Ivory Coast were observed and reported. When you arrived here, we were already suspicious. Your medical credentials were genuine, but your behavioral patterns were inconsistent, with purely humanitarian motivations." "What gave me away specifically?" Dr. Laurent asked. "Several things," Diallo replied. "Your financial resources exceeded what would be expected from your declared background. Your communication patterns suggested contacts outside the medical community. Most importantly, your psychological profile indicated training in deception and manipulation." Dr. Laurent was impressed, despite her circumstances. "How did you develop that kind of capability?" "Necessity," Diallo said simply. "Leaders who challenge the established order must develop sophisticated survival mechanisms. We learned from experience and from allies who understood the threats we faced." On her 4th day in custody, Dr. Laurent received an unexpected visitor. President Traoré entered her detention room alone, carrying a tray with tea and simple biscuits. "I wanted to speak with you personally," he said, setting the tray on the desk and taking a seat across from her. "Mr. President," she began. But he raised a hand to stop her. "I've been thinking about our dinner conversation," he continued, "about your comments on France's relationship with Africa and about the need for Africans to define their own path forward." Dr. Laurent waited for him to continue. "I believe you were sincere when you said those things," he said. "I don't think they were just part of your cover story." "They weren't," she replied quietly. "Those were my genuine thoughts. Spending time here, seeing what you're trying to build, made me realize how wrong the French perspective really is." Traoré nodded. "That's what I thought. Which raises an interesting question. What should we do with you now?" Dr. Laurent was surprised by the question. "I assumed that decision had already been made." "Nothing is decided until it's announced," Traoré replied. "You've provided valuable information that will help protect many African leaders. You chose not to complete your mission when you had the opportunity. And I believe you've genuinely changed your perspective on these issues." He paused to pour tea for both of them. "But you're also a trained intelligence operative who attempted to assassinate a head of state. Those facts can't be ignored." "I understand," Dr. Laurent said. "Whatever you decide, I accept responsibility for my actions." "The question," Traoré continued, "is whether someone like you might be more valuable as an ally than as a prisoner." Dr. Laurent looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "You have knowledge and skills that could be useful in protecting African interests. You understand French intelligence operations from the inside. You have medical training that could benefit our people. Most importantly, you've demonstrated that people can change their fundamental loyalties when confronted with truth." The conversation continued for over an hour, during which Traoré outlined a possibility that Dr. Laurent had never considered: remaining in Africa permanently as a genuine humanitarian worker and intelligence advisor, using her knowledge to help protect African leaders from French manipulation. "It would mean giving up any possibility of returning to France," he warned. "Your former colleagues would consider you a traitor, and they might attempt to eliminate you themselves." "I already am a traitor," Dr. Laurent replied. "And I've seen enough of French policy in Africa to know which side deserves my loyalty." 2. Weeks after Dr. Laurent's capture, President Traoré made a decision that would reshape the political landscape of West Africa. Rather than handling the incident through diplomatic channels, he would expose the entire operation publicly, using Dr. Laurent's testimony and the evidence they had gathered to reveal the extent of French intelligence activities in the region. The broadcast was carefully planned and professionally produced. It began with Traoré speaking directly to the camera in his office, with the flags of Burkina Faso and the African Union visible behind him. "My fellow Africans, he began. "I speak to you today about a threat that affects not just Burkina Faso, but our entire continent. For too long, we have suspected that our former colonial masters continued to manipulate our affairs through covert operations. Today, I can prove it." The video then transitioned to excerpts from Dr. Laurent's confession, with her face obscured to protect her identity. Her voice, speaking in clear French, described her training, her mission, and the broader scope of Operation Hippocrate. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Photographs of secret meetings, copies of intelligence documents, audio recordings of operational briefings, all combined to create an irrefutable case that France was conducting assassination operations against African leaders. The international reaction was immediate and dramatic. Within hours of the broadcast's release, it had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms. News organizations around the world picked up the story, and diplomatic channels buzzed with urgent communications. In Paris, the French government initially attempted to dismiss the allegations as propaganda, but the evidence was too comprehensive and specific to be easily discredited. Emergency meetings were convened at the Élysée Palace as officials struggled to contain the diplomatic damage. Colonel Morel, who had been expecting routine contact from Dr. Laurent, instead found himself under investigation by Ivorian authorities who had been alerted by Burkina Faso's intelligence service. Within 48 hours, he and 3 other DGSE operatives had been arrested, effectively dismantling the West African network. But the impact extended far beyond intelligence operations. The revelation that France was still actively working to eliminate African leaders who challenged its interests sparked massive protests across Francophone Africa. In Bamako, Niamey, Dakar, and Abidjan, crowds gathered to demand the expulsion of French officials and the end of economic agreements that favored European interests. The political consequences were swift and far-reaching. Mali and Niger accelerated their own plans to reduce French influence, citing the assassination plot as justification for more aggressive independence measures. Even traditionally, pro-French leaders in Senegal and Ivory Coast found themselves under pressure to reconsider their relationships with Paris. President Traoré followed up the initial broadcast with a series of speeches and interviews that framed the incident within the broader context of African liberation and self-determination. He was careful not to condemn all French citizens or all forms of international cooperation, but he used the assassination plot as evidence that Africa needed to be more assertive in defending its sovereignty. "They sent a doctor to kill me," he said in one particularly powerful address, "because they cannot tolerate the idea of Africans making their own decisions about their own future. But we are not children who need European guidance. We are not resources to be exploited. We are a proud people with our own vision for our continent's development." The speech resonated across Africa and beyond. Young Africans, in particular, embraced Traoré's message of dignity and self-determination. University students organized solidarity events, and social media campaigns spread his ideas to a global audience. The exposure of Operation Hippocrate marked a turning point in Franco-African relations that would have consequences for years to come. In the immediate aftermath, France found itself diplomatically isolated in West Africa, with even traditional allies distancing themselves from Paris to avoid being associated with the assassination scandal. The French government's response evolved through several phases. Initial denial gave way to grudging acknowledgement of rogue operations that did not reflect official policy. This was followed by vague promises of investigation and reform. Finally, facing mounting pressure from both African governments and French civil society, Paris was forced to make concrete concessions. The most significant was the recall of several high-ranking diplomatic and intelligence officials from African postings, and the announcement of new oversight procedures for French activities on the continent. While these measures were largely cosmetic, They represented an acknowledgement that the old patterns of behavior were no longer sustainable. More importantly, the incident accelerated trends that were already reshaping the region. The African Union established a new intelligence-sharing initiative specifically designed to identify and counter foreign covert operations. Economic cooperation agreements that had favored European interests were renegotiated with terms more favorable to African countries. Military cooperation programs were scaled back or terminated entirely. For Dr. Laurent, now living under the new identity of Dr. Claire Sankara, a name she had chosen to honor Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader of the 1980s, the transformation was both professional and personal. She continued to work as a physician, but now her medical practice was genuinely focused on serving the people of Burkina Faso rather than providing cover for intelligence operations. Her knowledge of French intelligence methods proved invaluable to Burkina Faso's security services. Working with Colonel Diallo, she helped identify and neutralize several other foreign intelligence operations that were targeting the country's leadership and resources. Her insights also contributed to security improvements that would protect President Traoré and other high-risk officials. But perhaps most significantly, her transformation became a symbol of the possibility for genuine change and redemption. Her story, while not publicized in detail, became known within diplomatic and intelligence circles as an example of how individuals could break free from institutional loyalties that conflicted with moral principles. President Traoré, meanwhile, consolidated his position both domestically and internationally. The assassination attempt, rather than weakening his government, had actually strengthened it by demonstrating the external threats that Burkina Faso faced and the competence with which his administration had handled the crisis. Domestically, public support for his government increased significantly. The revelation that France had tried to kill their president galvanized national unity in ways that speeches and policies alone could never have achieved. Even traditional opposition groups found themselves supporting Traoré's anti-colonial stance. Internationally, he emerged as a leading voice for African independence and dignity. Other African leaders, impressed by his handling of the crisis and emboldened by his example, began to adopt more assertive positions in their relationships with former colonial powers. 1 year after the assassination attempt, President Traoré stood on the balcony of the presidential residence, looking out over a country that had been transformed by the events of that dramatic period. The morning sun cast long shadows across the capital, and the sounds of daily life, vendors calling their wares, children playing in schoolyards, motorcycles navigating the busy streets, created the familiar symphony of African urban life. But something fundamental had changed. There was a new confidence in the air, a sense that Burkina Faso was truly charting its own course rather than following paths determined by others. The country's economy, while still facing significant challenges, was showing signs of improvement as new partnerships with non-traditional allies provided alternatives to French-dominated trade relationships. Educational reforms had begun to emphasize African history and achievement, rather than focusing primarily on European contributions to world civilization. Healthcare improvements, partly thanks to Dr. Sankara's continued work, were reducing child mortality rates and improving access to essential services. Most importantly, there was a palpable sense of national pride that had been absent for decades. The assassination plot and its exposure had also had broader implications for the African continent. The African Union had established new mechanisms for intelligence cooperation and mutual defense against foreign interference. Economic integration projects were moving forward more rapidly as countries sought to reduce their dependence on former colonial powers. Perhaps most significantly, a new generation of African leaders was emerging, younger, more educated, and more committed to genuine independence than their predecessors. They looked to Traoré's example as proof that it was possible to challenge the established order without destroying their countries in the process. In her clinic in Ouagadougou, Dr. Sankara continued her work with the same dedication she had once applied to intelligence operations, but now with the satisfaction of knowing that her efforts were genuinely helping the people she served. She had become fluent in Moor and Dioula, the local languages, and was working on training programs to expand the country's capacity to provide quality health care. Her relationship with her past remained complicated. She knew that she would never be able to return to France safely, and she occasionally wondered about former colleagues and friends from her previous life. But she had found a new purpose and identity that felt more authentic than anything she had experienced during her years as an intelligence operative. The children she treated at the clinic didn't know about her background or the dramatic events that had brought her to their country. To them, she was simply Dr. Claire, the foreign doctor who spoke their language and always seemed to have time to listen to their concerns and answer their questions. Colonel Morel, meanwhile, had been convicted by an Ivorian court and sentenced to 15 years in prison for espionage and conspiracy. Several other DGSE operatives had received similar sentences, effectively ending France's intelligence network in West Africa and serving as a deterrent to future operations. The French government had quietly compensated Burkina Faso for the attempted assassination, though the amount and terms of the settlement were never made public. More importantly, France had been forced to renegotiate several economic agreements, under terms that were more favorable to African interests. President Traoré used the anniversary of the assassination attempt to deliver a major address on the future of African development. Standing before a crowd of thousands in Ouagadougou's main square, he spoke about the progress that had been made and the challenges that remained. 1 year ago, he began, they sent a doctor to kill me because they could not tolerate an Africa that thinks for itself, that acts in its own interests, that refuses to accept that our role is simply to provide resources for others to process and profits for others to enjoy. The crowd responded with enthusiastic applause and chants of support. But we are still here, he continued, stronger than before, more united than before, and more determined than before to build the Africa that our ancestors dreamed of and our children deserve. He spoke about the new partnerships that Burkina Faso had developed with countries like Ghana, Algeria, and Morocco, relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than dependency and exploitation. He outlined plans for educational expansion, infrastructure development, and economic diversification that would reduce the country's vulnerability to external pressure. But perhaps most importantly, he spoke about the psychological transformation that had occurred, the recovery of African confidence and dignity that had been eroded by decades of being told that they needed foreign guidance to manage their own affairs. We have proven that Africa can protect itself, he declared. We have proven that African intelligence can match any foreign intelligence. We have proven that African unity can overcome any external threat. And we have proven that when we stand together, when we think for ourselves, when we act with courage and wisdom, there is no limit to what we can achieve. As the crowd dispersed after the speech, President Traoré reflected on how much had changed since that evening when he had nearly consumed a poison supplement that would have ended his life and potentially altered the trajectory of African history. The assassination attempt had been intended to remove a troublesome leader and preserve the established order. Instead, it had accelerated the very changes it was meant to prevent, creating a catalyst for African awakening that its planners had never anticipated. In her apartment that evening, Dr. Sankara watched coverage of the anniversary events on television. She thought about the choice she had made a year earlier, the decision not to complete her mission that had changed not only her own life, but the lives of millions of people across the continent. She had been trained to serve French interests, but she had chosen to serve human dignity instead. She had been taught to see Africans as subjects to be managed, but she had learned to see them as equals deserving respect. She had been conditioned to view political manipulation as necessary and justified, but she had come to understand the moral bankruptcy of such thinking. As she prepared for another day of medical work, Dr. Sankara felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with professional achievement or personal advancement. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she should be doing, serving people who deserved far better than they had received from the world for far too long. Outside her window, the sounds of Ouagadougou at night created their own. Music, distant conversations, the call to prayer from neighborhood mosques, the laughter of children playing in courtyards, the rumble of traffic on roads that led to villages where life continued much as it had for centuries. But beneath the surface continuity, everything had changed. Africa was awakening, and nothing would ever be the same again. The transformation of West Africa accelerated in the years following the exposure of Operation Hypocrite. What began as a crisis for French interests evolved into a comprehensive reordering of political and economic relationships throughout the region. President Traoré's example inspired similar movements across the continent. In Senegal, a new generation of leaders came to power promising to renegotiate economic agreements with France. In Ivory Coast, civil society organizations successfully pressured the government to reduce its dependence on French military support. Even in traditionally stable countries like Benin and Togo, political movements emerged demanding greater economic sovereignty. The African Union's new intelligence cooperation initiative proved remarkably effective at identifying and countering foreign covert operations. Several attempted assassinations and coup plots were uncovered and prevented, creating a much more secure environment for African leaders who challenged external interference. Economically, the region began to develop new patterns of trade and investment that reduced dependence on former colonial powers. Intra-African trade increased dramatically as countries developed the infrastructure and financial mechanisms needed to support economic integration. New partnerships with Asian and Middle Eastern countries provided alternative sources of investment and technological transfer. Dr. Sankara, now fully integrated into Burkina Faso society, had established a training program that was producing a new generation of African physicians and healthcare workers. Her program emphasized not just medical skills, but also the importance of serving one's own people and community rather than seeking opportunities in wealthier countries. She had married a Burkina Faso engineer named Amadou Ouedraogo and had two children who were growing up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with African traditions and international perspectives. Her transformation from French intelligence operative to African community leader was complete, and she had found a fulfillment that her previous life had never provided. The assassination attempt that had failed so spectacularly had indeed changed history, but not in the way its planners had intended. Instead of preserving French influence in Africa, it had accelerated its decline. Instead of eliminating a troublesome leader, it had elevated him to continental prominence. Instead of maintaining the established order, it had catalyzed revolutionary change. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that Africa possessed the intelligence, courage, and unity necessary to protect itself and chart its own course toward a more prosperous and dignified future. In Ouagadougou, children who were too young to remember the dramatic events of 5 years earlier grew up in a country that was more confident, more prosperous, and more hopeful than the one their parents had known. They attended schools that taught them about African achievements and possibilities rather than focusing primarily on foreign accomplishments. They received health care from providers who understood their culture and spoke their languages. They lived in a society that believed in its own capacity for progress and development. The white doctor who had arrived with poison in her medical bag had instead brought something far more valuable, proof that change was possible, that people could choose principle over profit, and that Africa's future would be determined by Africans themselves. President Traoré, now recognized as one of Africa's most important leaders, continued to work toward the vision of continental unity and prosperity that had motivated his revolutionary movement. The assassination attempt that was meant to end his leadership had instead established him as a symbol of African resilience and determination. And somewhere in the archives of the DGSE, a file marked Operation Hippocrate served as a reminder of how intelligence operations could backfire spectacularly when they underestimated the intelligence, courage, and moral clarity of the people they sought to manipulate. The age of African awakening had begun, and there would be no going back to the old patterns of domination and dependency. The future belonged to those who had the vision to imagine it and the courage to build it. One choice, one day, one life at a time.